So some of you, I think most of you know this, but some of you may not know what we actually do. And you think like they do the wild conversation. This is what we do all week long, Kevin. We just meet, we just do this. This is all we do. And so what we actually do that allows us to do this for as many people who can come is providing a system for whole and intentional leader development inside of organizations. And some of you have used it as coaches with individuals or with teams, and some of you are using it across your employee population. I want you to know that because that's like literally what we spend most of our lives doing, is providing, and in most cases, a monthly curated conversation using the tools as the Wild Toolkit as a structural scaffold for that, having that conversation once a month and providing people that pause together with intention, with a common language. I say that because this conversation today is so much into the heart of what we are all about. And I'll tell you some of the things that I've heard. I want to read you a couple of quotes from people that we've worked with who have built a culture of investment or in the process. And here's one leader said in our sphere said that my team is now, my team is now asking for development conversations, asking for these investment conversations that connect the business to who they are. And he said 1 year ago, they were saying, why are we doing this? So the same people that were saying, why are we doing this, are now saying, like, why did we miss that last week? You know, it's like, it's been crazy. Listen to that. Another person said, our emerging leader was told by his team 1 year ago, by a member, 1 year ago, I didn't believe you had the capacity to lead us. And now I know you do. That was within 1 year. And that I've seen change occur in you that is inspiring them to change. Another person said, this is in the last week or so, someone said, this was an uncomfortable but helpful conversation. And then one other leader, this is in higher ed. Those of you that come out of higher ed, like someone in a university said, and we were working with their senior leadership team, they said when they were building a culture of investment in their people, investing in others, and they said, before this, it was necessary, and now it is necessary and not optional. And so that was just a powerful thing. So I want you to imagine this. I want you just to imagine it. And if you are there, amazing. But what if your organization's culture was known as a place that invested in your people right out of the gate? Like, I mean, invested in them, like with a true deep investment. What would change? How would that impact things like recruitment? How would it impact hiring selection? How would it impact how people deal with conflict and adversity? How would it impact the performance of your team? Like if we actually had a culture where this kind of investment is taking place in people in a way that was meaningful to them, what would change? And I want to suggest to you that a culture of investment is a culture where every part of the organization explicitly and implicitly has that this is stated as something that is valued, and we're investing in people for the sake of them and for the sake of the organization. And so in order to talk about culture, I always have to do this. I know some of you have heard me talk about this before, but we have to define culture. Like, this is a big word and it's used often. My favorite culture person is Edgar Schein. Some of you, let's give a big whoop to Schein. All right. And he just made it simple and approachable. I've been teaching this to graduate students for years, and I think it really has some really practical. And so I'm going old school. This is wild conversation, like old school. Those of you that have been around for a while will remember this because we're using a very high-tech thing called a clipboard. All right. So this is the way Schein, I love this metaphor of the iceberg when he talked about culture. And he talks about culture as a set of shared values, beliefs, and assumptions that have been used in the past, that have been affirmed, and people agree with them. They kind of have worked well enough to be considered valid. That's the way he says it. And therefore, these things get passed on to new members as the way to think and behave and all these things. So it's like, it's something, it's assumptions, stated values, and artifacts, all these things about our culture that have worked well enough in the past to be considered valid. And so we teach them to new people as they come in. It's like deeply embedded. So that's what culture is. And Schein talks about, this is why I love the iceberg. He talks about the tip of the iceberg, you have artifacts. So artifacts being like the physical structures, especially when you think about, my dad always said that he believes that the threshold of buildings is really important. because when you walk into a building, when we used to walk into buildings, for some of us, who have gone all virtual, but like, remember that some of us still do, that the threshold into a space is important because it tells you something about the people. Kind of fascinating, right? That artifacts matter. He also talked about stated values. So if you look at the slide, I just called this a slide. So if you look at this, stated values are, DJ, that's funny, right? Are still above the surface. So what Shine is saying is like the things we say are important. They matter. They're a part of culture, but they're still above the surface. And that most of what culture is about is assumptions. Assumptions, not necessarily explicit, but they are deeply assumed. And the deeper you go, that the more you begin to understand what culture is really about. Like most of culture is things we just assume about what's happening. And I want to suggest something to you that I'm going to come back to. That most of the culture change literature and most of the things that we have been taught about culture and changing culture focus on changing culture. Okay? And I want to suggest to you the possibility that because of that is one of the reasons that we've struggled to change cultures. That to change people's assumptions comes down to an issue of individual change. So if we could actually change the way the individual people thought about themselves, that is what's going to change teams. It's what's going to change what our organizations are about. Because until our organizations are run by robots, they still will be run by human beings. And so, but you know what I mean? Where most of our culture change efforts, we read books about changing culture, but those books don't talk about what does it mean to change a person. And this is this interesting connection between the psychology of a person and what's happening organizationally. So if that's what culture is about, according to Shine, let me just talk through some of the assumptions that are deeply embedded in our culture of leader development. All right, that I think we can possibly learn from and rethink. What are the assumptions about development that are really going on in many, many organizations? And I'm not bashing all this because some of these things are important, but they might leave us wanting more. So one thing, development is training, reading a book, going to a conference, or it's a 2-day offsite with an inspiring speaker. That happens all day long. And I'm not bashing inspiring speakers. Like I hope when I speak to people that it's inspiring, but is that going to change cultures? Development is up to you to find it. Do you know what I'm saying? Go search it out. Offer classes that have little relevance or a week-long program where within 2 weeks, one of you told me this last week, you go through a week-long sort of development program like summer camp, and then within 2 weeks, you're sinking again. You know who you are if we had that conversation this week. Development is performance management disguised as development. You know what I'm saying? Like that's very typical in sales cultures, by the way. Leader development this is overstated, but is a soul-sucking, boring, and outdated process, or it's something that senior leaders don't actually do because they want to develop their leaders, but for them personally, it's a lot of noise. So it's hilarious to me that people invest in leader development programs for their leaders, and the leaders who invested actually don't use the programs. That cracks me up. I'm sorry, but they're leaders, right? So it's like, okay, or development is a personality test that we took. And it's evaluated on whether or not people liked it, but not whether or not they learned anything. All right. So it's like, I'm kind of bashing myself because I've done a lot of this work for years. But what does it mean to build a culture of investment, a culture that's building for the long haul? What does it mean where people are seen, but challenged to grow? So it's about them, but it's not all about them. And where every person is building themselves up around the assumption that not only they matter, but everyone else matters and the organization matters. And that's where it gets kind of interesting, right? Like there's things that we need to change. What does it mean where we're not defined by blame on others who are different, but engaging in thoughtful discussions, pushing progress forward? Where we're an organization, a culture that's full of people who don't blame leaders because everyone recognizes that they may lead next. We got to be really careful when we just blame leaders and we stop the story there, because the reality is we may be called to lead next. It's interesting. A culture where people where conflict is still hard, but it's not something to be avoided because we know that our growth and the organization's growth will depend on it. A culture of grace, of sacrifice, of conviction, and of working hard at bettering ourselves. And a culture where everyone doesn't necessarily get to have it their way, but where we never let our agendas get in the way of our movement forward. You know, like what does a stretch kind of culture look like? And I think the challenge with building a culture like that, like why is it so hard? It sounds, for me, y'all, like if you're like me, I'm like, I want to work there. Like, why is it difficult? And here are some, like, to think about why is it difficult. One of the reasons I think building a culture where we really do invest in others is because it's difficult because people have never seen it before. So we don't trust, and we don't typically trust things we've never seen before. You know what I mean? Like we're not used to this. And I think in some ways, even our leadership development culture is in a rut, and it's a deep and scientific rut, by the way, that has some things to offer us. Like I'm a scientist, I'm an empiricist, so don't hear me slamming science. But I think at the same time, our field of developing leaders has kind of gotten us in a rut. It's probably affected even smaller organizations. I think it's also that this issue, why it's hard, is we will default to the urgent over the important. We will default to the urgent over the important if we are not moving with intention. Do you hear me? I can't tell you over and over again. Like people will say, like, I can't take 60 minutes aside with my entire leadership team to have a conversation once a month. You can't? You know, I'm like, okay, that's another possibility. Here's another thing. Why is it hard? In the short term, doing the right thing requires more maintenance than doing the easy thing. In the short term, if you have a short-term mindset, doing the right thing requires more maintenance than doing the easy thing. And so it's just interesting, right? It requires maintenance, and we don't think about that. It's much easier to do the easier thing. And here's the other thing, is that culture is not stated in moments, it's built over time. Culture is not stated in moments, it's built over time, and so are people. And so what if everything from the stated values to the deepest assumption was about investing in people for the long haul? What if it was about that? And what's interesting is that if you think about it this way, there are very few things in my life that I commit to doing on a regular basis that occur without a system and accountability built in. There are just very few things. I don't know. There are some things, but especially I wrote likely none, other than things that are solely for your own enjoyment and benefit. Like my brother is painting like crazy right now, and I think there's a reason, and he has a system for doing that. But otherwise, almost nothing. Everything has a system and a relationship attached to it, where we actually have deep and sustaining change. So I want to talk you through. We wrote a document called the 10 Strategies for Building a Leadership Development Culture. And I'm not going to go through all 10, but Claire's going to put this into the chat. So you can open this up if you want. I want to focus on 5 that I think are what this is about. Some of the things that we have seen that are really important to think through when it comes to building an investment culture where we're investing in others. And I think whether it's leaders or just in general populations of people in your organization, I think these are some things to think about. So as you're opening that up, I'm going to go, I just picked 5. They're all important, but these are ones that I would say out of the gate are kind of necessary. The first one is this: commit to developing leaders, commit to investing in people. And I would say this, that what you actually value is what you will do. And this is a courageous and a firm commitment. It takes guts to invest in people. It just does. It takes guts. And one of the reasons I think it takes guts, we've seen this over and over again, it takes leaders who are willing to say, I'm going to look at myself, leaders who are willing to say, I know this is going to be weird for you, but it takes courage to actually commit to using what we already know about developing people and doing it. And so that's what we mean by commit to developing leaders. Even when people are going to say, like, people do not trust that when we tell people, for example, like with we use this system called the Wild Toolkit, right? And we say, like, no one can see your feedback report. It's crazy how rarely people have experienced that before. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're used to people looking over our shoulder, and it's like, we want you to be honest. The second one is number 6 on the list. So I'm going to jump from 1 to 6. And this is a big one for us, is encourage real conversations. And I put in parentheses, invite real conversations. You have to architect for increasing vulnerability regarding personal and strategic things that matter. and you have to architect for it out of the gate. So when you experience even the wild conversation, this whole conversation is structured and architected for each of us to feel a little bit more trusting sooner, so that we can have a conversation that's a little more real. And so encouraging and inviting and architecting real conversations is number 6. Number 7, use processes and tools for feedback and reflection. And one of the things that we have seen is that people need a common language. It's one of the reasons that I think tools are really helpful, but not a common language that is based on the recent fad. Okay, so here's the challenge is, if you use tools and processes that are built out of the language that we know, how people actually talk, then that common language will have a longer stand in terms of its stickiness. Do you know what I'm saying? So like if I'm trying to think, I don't want to bash anything current, but you know what the current books are that are popular topics that get popular. The challenge with that language is it will die. But if we use tools and systems and processes that are built on real conversations that people have every day, or that we know that they're going to have at a deeper level, then it has some stickiness in that. Because, and that's back to this thing is like everything in our organizations that works has a system. Why don't we have a system for investing in people? That's all I'm saying. This is my way of this is my sad dog face. Okay, the next one, number 8, leverage experiential learning opportunities. Why does it say that? Because it is very clear from decades of research that people learn through experience. Okay, so if your organization is a tough place to work, there is one good thing. It is a developmental laboratory. You hear me say that all the time. If there are crucible experiences happening that are horrible and you don't want to experience them, the one benefit is that learning is a laboratory for learning, especially when developmental efficacy is opened up. So leveraging experiential opportunities alongside that system, like bringing conversations where, what are we experiencing right now? And how is that relevant to my personality, how I'm showing up under pressure? How do I learn from this? What competencies am I learning in this experience? When you bring that system alongside just the real cauldron of experience, amazing things happen in terms of culture building toward investment. And then the last one, I'm going to go to number 10, is connect leadership development or in this investment to people to the mission. So this is about people, but don't hear me saying like, we need cultures where we invest in people. I'm not complaining about this. What I'm saying is that the people matter, but so does the organization's strategy. Like how we're actually accomplishing something. That's true. When I told you that like what we do all day long, we get to do this work. This is not an economic engine for us. So like one of the reasons we get to do this work is because the Wild Leaders mission and strategy is working on the business side of our life. So we get to have these kinds of conversations. So we get to give back. So it's about the people, but when you connect them together, it gets really powerful. And I come back to what I said. The powerful thing is that if you want to change culture, and this is what Schein didn't talk about, but he did get to this a little bit, you have to change the individuals. And change is not prescribed, it's invited. And so if you create an invitation to development, what would change in our cultures if every person was changing? So I want, Daniel, before I finish, Daniel, I want you to share, because we did an impact study on what happens when you do some of those things. And I just want you to take a look. So Dr. Halleck, show us some stuff.
So this is a long list of things that we've seen when from a bunch of data when people invest in developing a culture over the long term, some of the things that change. And I just wanted to pick out a couple to highlight. And imagine a leader like this, a person in a business, when you have a leader who is steadfast in trials and is secure in who they are, so they're not working overtime to make everybody else happy just for the sake of placating them and getting artificial consensus. They're productive, so they're getting stuff done. They're compassionate, so they're not getting stuff done at the expense of other people. And they have a clear sense of where they're going and why, for their sake, but also for the sake of the people who are around them. And that's just a sketch, if you will, off a couple of the things we've seen can change when a investment culture gets spinning.
I think for some of you, as you look at that list, all those changes were there. We wanted to call out a couple of those things. So just look at the power of those things. Like what happens when individuals are feeling those things. what happens to the functioning of teams, what happens to the functioning of their departments, and what happens to the functioning of the whole organization. That's why we get excited about this. And Daniel, will you launch us out? Let's go crowdsource this together.
Now, so